Thank you. Didn't know I deserved standing without saying anything. But today I'll be talking about building reorderable user interfaces in Elm. And what's interesting is I pitched this as, oh, look, I built something. And I got accepted. I was very excited about that. But what it really became more of was this process of me stumbling into building packages that I didn't know anything about to start with. And so the first part of this talk is going to be about a lot of lessons I learned during that, and then how they apply to reorderable in the second half. So hello. I'm a web developer at Zendesk. I work on a front-end team trying to make conversations between support agents and customers just go a little nicer. And the reason that I'm in front-end really is because I love the feeling of hearing, ooh, that's nice, from other humans. You know, having a service talk to another service, I don't get that kind of verbal affirmation. So I'm going to start with that story about how I got into writing some packages. And really what that comes down to is I was trying to do everything at once. I just graduated university a year and a half ago, and I learned Elm and front-end at the same time, so I'm pretty lucky in that space, I'm sure. But what that meant was I was trying to build things for reuse because my university told me reuse is what you went to school for. Let's generalize everything. And as Evan brought up in his talk earlier today, are things actually similar? Are they the same? Those are great questions to ask before you start building something for everything. And so before even writing a single app in Elm, I already wanted to build these reusable things. And that's quite a high order when I didn't even know the language. So to have even working UI would be nice. So some kind and pragmatic Elm developers told me at the Elm meetup, like, what if you just build it for you, right? Like for what you're going to build right now. What are you building? And I didn't really even have an answer to that because I don't know. I just wanted to build for everyone. But that was good advice, and I should have followed it, but I was out of school and kind of cocky and thought, you know, nah, I got this. I don't need that. So I set out to create this autocomplete package, or type ahead, you may call it, and I added all these examples because I was so excited to write like front-end code. But I never questioned some of my core assumptions about that data model that, as we saw even in Evan's talk when we're asking about what makes these two checkbox lists similar, we were immediately thinking in terms of UI, when really the important thing here for sharing and reusing this set of features was what's the data model. And for me, I was so naive as to think, what if it was just a list of strings? Well, how many services do you really use as a developer where you're just pulling a list of strings from somewhere? So the entire API really didn't make sense when you try to make a production app. They made sense for these pretty examples, but I never really questioned my core assumptions. So luckily, Evan, thank you for pairing with me. You gave me a lot of new ideas coming in from a fresh perspective of someone who actually knows a little bit about Elm. And it gave me a lot of needed direction. So there were a few times when you're building as a developer where you already know how you're going to solve the problem that you started solving. And I think coming to that acceptance is important because it was a rather humbling experience having someone come in and be like, well, what if we just started new? And that's a good thing, having someone come in and that's your user, right? You're building this code not for other code to consume, but for another human writing code to consume. And so the code's going to be messy while we're learning, and I think it's important that we all recognize that that's okay, and that learning has its place, and it's what we do all the time if we want to be good developers. And so making that something useful is hard, and that's what I was chasing to solve hard problems because they were interesting. But really, it's making something nice to use that is the more ambitious and useful and harder approach. And so I really want the Elm Communities package ecosystem to be in the latter category. And so I want to give a big thanks to Evan there for helping guide me into this line of thinking. So even with all that and all of a language author's help, I still didn't do enough user testing. I didn't put this package out there for production apps. I didn't build a production app with it. And I had some questions that I was getting on the Slack channel and from others in GitHub issues. And a lot of them centered around how does this look when I start using it in multiple places? Is it really an autocomplete if it doesn't have an input field? That's also a really valid question. And could I provide some drop-in defaults? A lot of those things are not necessarily immediate API decisions that you think you need to make, but they are really important questions that get answered as soon as you put it in front of another person. So this really where I learned to ask all these questions immediately now was when I built my first app in Elm. It took only a year to start writing an app. But this was an app I wrote called Goat, hence the cute goat. It stands for Graphic Ornamentation and Annotation Tool. So you can add annotations to images, text boxes, and whatnot. But surprisingly, building this app actually taught me more about package design than any of the packages I was working on writing. And I want to talk about why that is with this section of what if we built APIs like we built products. So let's talk about what a typical path is to reuse when you're a developer. Manager or customer says, I need this feature. And so the first thing you do is you make it work, right? Like that, nothing of this was reuse. You just wanted to write your feature and have it work. So you ship it immediately. And now it's out in production, and you build it, and you're proud of it, and that's awesome. But you want to add some more customization so it can work somewhere else. You just really didn't want to have to rewrite that bit of code. And maybe you didn't break it up perfectly, but you wanted to throw it somewhere else into your app. And then you're really proud of it, so you market it to some other developers on your team or maybe other teams. You may be at a big company, or maybe you make a blog post about it, and it starts getting wider use. And with a wider audience comes usually wider concerns for that package. And so you add more and more customizations. And maybe you even add some more configuration for some use case that you didn't really want it to solve, but you figured you didn't want to make that person have to go write their own thing. You couldn't say no. And then a certain number of months later, there's like this demand for rewriting the thing, or I'm going to go build my own solution to this. And now there's another competing standard, right? And so it starts to look a bit like a Jenga tower gone awry. And I wanted to bring in this quote of, instead of imagining that our main task is to instruct a computer what to do, let's concentrate rather on explaining to human beings what we want a computer to do. So if we have this line of thinking from the get-go, and we're thinking about our developers as end users, APIs become first-class citizens. We treat that development more like the products that we're using the APIs to build. And so the first thing you do when you want to go pitch something to the market is you research the topic in the market. You see what's out there, you see what people have done, you see what people like. You try not to stray too much from what is expected. And then you want to determine out of that, what is the niche you're trying to solve. You're not trying to solve for all of them immediately. You just want to do something really nice, like one good thing nice. And that's finding the usefully reusable piece. And then you're going to propose this API and test these assumptions with other developers. That's your user audience. That's who you're targeting. And getting people early access to using it to build something, I think, is really key, because that fast iteration, you learn what people are struggling with. And having empathy there is enormously powerful. So you can see now the fourth step is building it. Instead, the first step in the last strategy was building it. And if we repeat these first four steps over and over again, we're going to come out a lot happier when we do end up shipping it. And so I just want to reinforce as the last part of this first half of the developer just being another type of user. And I think very often we don't treat someone like that. So building actual reorderable. This is jQuery's version of reorderable called Sortable. And it's the basic case of just moving an item around on a screen. There's little to no setup. You just add a CSS class, and everything works, which is great, except that extending that functionality can be rather challenging for reasons I won't go into. But some concepts that we saw at play just in that last GIF was that we have a placeholder, which is the item that's currently underneath the mouse. We have items that are non-placeholders, which is just every other item in the list that is not the placeholder. And I'm calling it a drop preview, where we are dropping this placeholder that we're moving. And And so we have some goals for the package. This would be the common case, something just a simple to-do list of moving things around. And that's, yeah, being able to move an element, show some kind of preview, in this case, a spacing, and shifting these elements while the element under the mouse is moving. But then we also have a more advanced case, which is, what about if we disallowed some of these reorderable elements from entering other lists? And so this is an example from a JavaScript sortable library, where in one list we can only pull and put pieces, and one we can only pull but we can't reorder, and in one we can only put them. This might be your use case. I'm not sure exactly if this would be like fruits.com, but it'd be for some site. But every step of this, right, should be able to get customized and animated, styled however you like. If you can't do those things, I think the package itself is just gone. It's gone for you. Like, you have to go and redo all that mouse work, because if you didn't expose enough, then someone couldn't do a nice sliding transition or some kind of shake once it lands. So it's important that we think about those cases while we're designing that common case solution as well. So this is the part of the talk on strategy of how do we actually build for both of those. So this is a strategy that I found has been very useful while building packages. And that's starting with an API that does the least so that the consumer can do the most. And what I mean by this is, like, what's the least amount of state that your app can carry, your package can hold on to, and what behaviors that it's doing as messages. Can you enumerate those in a small manner? Are there a lot of them? How big is this getting? The less it does, the easier it is to make sure that you're always informing the consumer of the things that they care about. And from there, you can create some of those simple examples, like the first common case set, and then the advanced ones where you are pulling and putting rules on different lists. And if there's still too much to get started, if you look at your docs that are generated and you're like, well, okay, I need to know about like 8 functions to even just get something on the screen, there isn't a magic number, and it's rather just a kind of feeling. And if you shadow someone and see them try to use your library, you might get a good feeling as to, oh, this is a lot of complexity right in your face right away. And so to kind of solve that, good defaults are really useful. Just having some default animations, maybe no animations, having helpers to set up like some views that are very common. And then maybe if you get something that's good and pretty good and a very complicated advanced example, maybe just break that into its own package that your package is reliant on, or that depends on your simpler package. So from there, I usually start with the data structure of what's the most common query that we're asking of the data. And for drag and drop, which is a little different than reorderable, we're talking about moving an item into different zones on the page, maybe call them buckets. And so identifiers of these buckets might be strings or integers, but the order doesn't matter. But for reorderable, order is the only thing that really matters. And so the index is the ultimate source of truth here. So when we're choosing this data structure, let's just consider the super common ones. A dictionary doesn't preserve ordering, so while that may have worked for drag and drop, it does not play well for reorderable. But for a linked list, well, you can look up, but you're checking linearly the full length of the list to go and do some kind of insert and replace and shift. And then for an array, those lookups are a little quicker, so I went with an array for reorderable. And so at this point, I want to beware the code powering reorderable is actually really short, and I would empower everyone after I put out a blog post or something after this, just go and read it. The state's actually just 2 keys in a record. You have a placeholder, or not key, field, sorry. You have a placeholder, which is maybe some kind of thing underneath the mouse. And then the reordered items are just an array, which is, at a glance, not that much is going on, right? And the placeholder itself is actually just a point in space where it comes from and where it may be going, because it could be over not a valid destination. And then you'll also notice here that I take any type of data for this placeholder and house it within the structure so that you don't have to go and query it later by ID. Is that a good choice? I've tried a couple different iterations. It was really nice for the examples I was playing with. And so just that amount of code, just that state, allowed for the behavior that we see here, which is having dynamically sized items, having them reorder nicely, have styled drop zones, and having a sliding animation. And that was all the actual state. So that's pretty useful to know that that's the full breadth of your package. But what's interesting here is that doing the sliding animation is, in this case, it was done with Elm-style animation, and it was done in the surrounding example. So I needed to expose a way of saying, when did my placeholder get dropped? And how do I animate from one area to the next? So providing that configuration to a user wasn't too hard, since I only had, I think, 3 messages, starting, dragging, and stopping. And I could just send that message, if you configured to listen to it, up to the consumer. So this is where update can take different shapes. What if for many, many features we don't care about custom animation and the extra messages are just boilerplate? Well, in the first update, you may have some configuration for what axis you drag on and reorder on. Its typical messages, its state, and the list of items that you're supplying it. But in the update with animation, maybe you care about something else, which is just, what about when the drag is started? What about when it's dragging? What about when it's finished? And you can use this pattern when you want to do more advanced things, but maybe update will take you most of the way for many features. So having this kind of option is rather nice. And so in this pinnable example, it came to be that that update with animation was very useful. And maybe it shouldn't even be called update with animation, because I was using it for more information around grouping. So when I saw myself start to abuse this, this function that I thought was just for animation behavior for this kind of grouping mechanism, I then added a concept of groups to the package. And I realized that this was useful as I did that research in the market and saw that there were other reorderable libraries that had this concept of groups. So in this case, when you pin and unpin, you get put into another group, and when you try to reorder into another group, it sends the original tab back to its starting position. And this is emulating the exact behavior of browser tabs. So that used to all be in the app, and now it's all in the package. And it's been rather nice to understand these use cases as you've been building them. So some of the questions I laid out in the description of the talk, I'm going to answer here, just as a kind of simple, rapid pace of, hey, what can you actually do with this? And what does this little bit of state and a couple messages really give us in flexibility? So does the user need a style preview of the drop zone? Well, if they want to style that, I give you that placeholder record and say, hey, there's maybe an index for you to style. And so if you're controlling that view, you have complete control over what that drop zone should look like. And what about the dropping action animating, the sliding that you saw with those tabs? How does that work? Well, if you want to build your own view for it, much like we saw in the Elm visualization library, you have all the configuration necessary to say, oh, when it's dropped, go and make my view look like X. So that's also something else that's expressible in this package. And if you also ask, well, what about the items being resized dynamically? In the first example, we saw different sized tabs that flexed based on the space of the screen. Well, Reorderable extracts those dimensions from the DOM and from the browser API, so it'll always be correct. Those bounds that it uses to check and see what you're over will always be right. I'm not doing any of my own funky math, which I originally was, which is why I'm bringing up that learning is great, but doesn't always end up in the nicest packages. And can the placeholder resize while dragging? Well, yes, because we're checking the bounds of the placeholder and everything else in the DOM at the same time. So all of these kind of advanced things we just get for free by doing little and storing little and using nice APIs for the web. And then an interesting question that came up as I was building the tabs was, well, if there's an overflow menu that goes up and down. And so we want to change axes the reorderable axes after a certain place you move the placeholder in the app. Well, that can be supported too if it goes in that configuration record and that just takes an argument saying, well, what's the piece of state that needs to change? What argument needs to change where we can now update the configuration for the new drag axis? So just having this concept of some configuration up front with a nice record and being able to opt in and out of that with maybe 2 different update functions gives you kind of the powers to build these really cool reorderable things. And so I think we all like at the end of using Elm packages to think, ooh, this is nice. Just the way that I want to think the same from end users using front-end products that I get to help build. So thank you.